So, looking at secession movements prior to the Civil War, there was the discussion in 1787, 1788, around the time that the Constitution was being ratified, about the secession of New York, New York. That is New York City. The conflict involved was that New York City had a lot more people who wanted to ratify, that is, accept the Constitution and join the United States, or join the Union. On the other hand, the rest of New York State had a lot more people who were suspicious of doing that and did not want to join the Union. And so you have a state of New York at odds with itself about whether or not it will join the United States. And New York, the large and important state to join. This is why the Federalist Papers were written, to try to convince New York to join the Union. New York's governor, George Clinton, led the Anti-Federalist cause against ratifying the Constitution. In other words, George Clinton was suspicious of New York joining the United States because he believed that in joining that grouping of states under the Constitution and federal government, that the power of New York State would be diminished. And so he actually wrote several essays. Historians are pretty sure they were him, even though they were anonymous, in what are known today as the Anti-Federalist Papers. But these were papers questioning whether or not it was wise to join the United States with this new and much more powerful federal government. Many believed that would be a betrayal of the American Revolution, which the whole point of declaring independence in the American Revolution was that the states could self-govern. And therefore, if they joined together in one union with one government, they would be in constant competition with one another for power. And there would be the threat or possibility of the threat that the US federal government would continue to grow and grow in power at the expense of the states. And so both of those things, to be fair to the Anti-Federalist cause, both of those things were true to an extent. Eventually, the states would have such a competition for power, focusing narrowly on the issue of slavery, they would be in competition with one another to the extent that there is eventually a civil war. And the US government did grow in its power and influence at the expense of the states. And the US government has basically gone from the time that we've studied it from its very beginning until where we are today, from being one of the smallest and governments on earth to the biggest government on earth. So that was the concern of the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists believed that it was necessary for all to join together in a constitution with a strong federal government. So there's this conflict within the state of New York. New York City not every single person, but let me just speak in some generalities here. New York City wants to join the United States, and New York State doesn't. So there was a threat that some of the southern counties, New York and several southern, counties of New York, to secede from New York State and join the federal union. So New York City almost exited the state of New York. Now, would New York State have let that happen? Well, it's a pretty powerful and important city. Would there have been a fight over this? It didn't end up happening, but it was threatened. New York eventually did ratify the Constitution and join the Union, so it didn't become an issue. But it raised an important point. New York had just fought a war on the right to declare independence. So can now New York City declare independence from New York? Well, it's a little bit more complicated with states and cities, because within a state, cities and counties are subdivisions that are created by the state. So for example, LA County in California is created by the state of California. That being said, California or Virginia were not created by the United States government. California is recognized as a state. Virginia was a state before the United States government existed. So the US government did not bring states into existence and subdivide them like states do for counties and counties do for cities. That being said, should the principle of declaring independence work down to that very level? If Palmdale doesn't want to be part of LA County, can it secede and declare independence? Right? If some county near Arizona no longer wants to be part of the state of California, but wants to join Arizona, or join, let's say California decides to exit the United States and gets enough votes to do that. Who knows what would happen? And how how the voting would take place. It would be by the people, the government, in a convention, whatever the case may be. But let's say that California votes to secede from the United States. It declares independence and becomes its own self-governing country, or at least that is its plan in this imaginary scenario. What if lots of the eastern counties of California don't want to do that, but instead want to remain part of the United States? Can those counties separate from California in order to rejoin the United States? Now, that's an imaginary example. Here's a real example from recent history. In 2014, Scotland had a vote whether or not to secede from or remain part of Great Britain. Great Britain consists of England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, at least as far as its islands are concerned. Scotland, for a long time, has viewed itself as separate. While it does share much with the English culture, and does consider itself British in many ways, the Scots have long fought for some type of independence from the English. So have the Irish. So have the Welsh. In 2014, Scotland had a vote whether or not to be part of Great Britain anymore. They didn't have anything against them. They just were voting whether or not they could be independent or remain. They eventually voted to remain, but Great Britain as a whole voted to leave the European Union. This was a movement called Brexit, which stood for British exit, which happened in 2016. Now, Scotland, most likely, the majority of people from Scotland would have liked to be part of this grouping called the European Union, but now because they are part of Britain, they had to leave. But they had just voted to remain part of Britain. So there are modern secession movements. The question is it their right to do that? And if Britain can exit from the European Union, then can the Irish, Welsh, and Scottish exit from Britain? In 1788, when Virginia accepted the Constitution, they had a convention, and it was a fairly close vote. It was a vote of only about 10 votes was the deciding factor. I believe it was 89 votes to 79. And if Virginia didn't join the Union, and accept the Constitution, it was unlikely a lot of other states would have as well. However, in the accepting of the Constitution, they put in an important clause. They said, "We, the delegates, do in the name and in behalf of the people of Virginia declare and make known that the powers granted under the Constitution being derived from the people of the United States may be resumed by them whensoever the same shall be perverted." In other words, what this has been understood as saying throughout history is that if Virginia has chosen to join, but if the US government fails or abuses its power, Virginia may choose to unjoin. Now, there is some debate over this clause, this statement, because it says the people of the United States may be resumed by them whensoever the same shall be perverted. So basically, some people have taken that to say, well, Virginia can exit the United States if it gets permission from all the other states. However, there's some problems with that. That's number one, that's not how Virginia joined. Number two, Virginia in 1788 would not have said that with the intention of we're joining and we have to ask permission to leave. And what it's likely saying here is talking about the people of the United States, is that the people in all of their states have continued to hold that right of whether or not they will continue as part of the United States. Now, you don't have to agree with that, but that is what was said in its context here. Make adjustment. New York made a similar statement. It said the powers of government may be reassumed by the people whensoever it shall become necessary to their happiness. Now, the people, it's not talking about the American people as a whole. It's either talking about the people of New York or the people of each of the individual states. So New York accepted the Constitution as well, but it included this clause where it talked about that if at any time New York in the future decides to reassume its own power and become its own self-governing country, again, they were all still viewed as self-governing countries. They just viewed joining the Constitution as joining a team with a federal government. And a federal government just manages some things on behalf of the states that participate in it. It's not meant to rule over the states. And the states give up some powers for that as well. Edit here. So, interestingly, and we don't have to have any view of secession because of this, this is just what several of the states were saying during the time. Thomas Jefferson continued to develop this theory. Jefferson argued that it would be better to separate from the United States than to submit to the destruction of liberty. In other words, if the US government was going to do something that would take away freedom from the people in the states through its actions or policies, he said that it would be that it should be resisted in the states. That's nullification. But he said that even though this would be a terrible thing to do, he said it would be better to exit the United States than to remain if it meant that the people were going to be exposed to a tyrannical government. Now, states can be a tyrannical government too, but Jefferson's theory was that you'd have more of a chance for freedom the more you spread power out and limited it, especially when that power is in government. So he said here, we are willing to view with indulgence, to wait with patience till those passions and delusions shall have passed, but determined, were we to be disappointed in this, to sever ourselves from that union we so much value, rather than give up the rights of self-government which we have reserved, and in which alone we see liberty, safety, and happiness. So for Thomas Jefferson, his theory during this time was that the states have the rights to join the Union, and they have a right to unjoin the Union. And in fact, the Constitution does not call itself a perpetual union like the Articles of Confederation did, because it was not assumed necessarily that the Constitution and that the union of the states at that time would last forever. That the union was just a convenient thing that was to the benefit of the states at that time. But Jefferson and others realized that circumstances change. States may no longer wish to be part of that union. They may join, they may unjoin, and form other types of organization of themselves within and outside their states. Jefferson also said, this was just another version of that quote. It's letter to Madison, 1799. When Jefferson was elected, many people were very upset. This was a changeover of power. Jefferson was of a different political party. He was seen as being pro-French rather than pro-British, and his predecessor Adams had been more pro-British, and different views of U.S. government and philosophies and the Constitution. But Thomas Jefferson won the election of 1800. Now, a lot of states were very upset with this, especially northern states in the New England region. And they threatened to exit the United States because of Jefferson's presidency. Now, Jefferson talks about this in his first speech as president and his first inaugural address when he's sworn in as president. And imagine you became president and a good amount of the country is talking about taking their states out of the Union just because you were in office. So it's fairly divisive back then as well as today. But Jefferson addressed this in his speech. And he said, if there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this union or to change its republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left free to combat it. Now he said, look, if there's anybody who wishes to dissolve this union, meaning separate themselves from the United States and no longer be a part of it, or if the Constitution requires that every state that joins has to be a republic. So he said, so if for Jefferson, if they wanted to change their governments from being a republic, which means a government that has voting, represents the people by representatives, and then makes rule of law. That's basically what a republican government means, or a government of a republic. And he says if somebody a state wants to change that, well, the Constitution requires that you be a republic as part of being in the United States. However, if someone wants to change it, they have to leave the United States. So he says, look, if any states want to exit the United States, or if any states want to exit the United States in order to change the format of their government, what does he say that should happen to those states and those people? Does he say, let's go fight a war to make them remain? Let's threaten them? Let's cut off trade with them? Let's sanction them? Well, Jefferson's view was that was allowed. Jefferson was the author of the Declaration of Independence. So his philosophy was, well, that's up to free people to decide. If they no longer want to be part of a government, they declare independence and they govern themselves. So he said, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated. In other words, he says, we think that they're wrong, but just because they're wrong doesn't mean that they should be unsafe, that they should be attacked. They can be safe in their error of opinion and tolerated, traded with. And basically, Jefferson said, well, let's just prove them wrong. They have the freedom to do that. And he said also, reason is left free to combat it. In other words, let's talk and debate and argue about it rather than exercising violence. So Jefferson, even when he became president and people were threatening to secede from the Union, he believed that was their right. Now, this brings up a key question, because when Abraham Lincoln becomes president and states are threatening and actually going to exit the Union and secede, Lincoln has a pretty different view than Jefferson. Lincoln says basically, at first, let them stand undisturbed, but he says that he would make war in order to collect taxes from these seceding states. So, how did the philosophies change from Jefferson, who was president, elected? Lots of states are saying he was exiting. They were exiting. And Jefferson says, that's your right to do so. Stand undisturbed as in error and tolerated in your error of opinion, and we'll try to prove you wrong. And you can rejoin the United States at a later time if that is your wish. To Lincoln, where the view of the day is that secession is not a right and is in fact treason and will be met with force. So there's a change of perspective on that issue. People also threatened to secede after the Louisiana Purchase. This is where we'll end for today. But the Louisiana Purchase added double the size of the country. Most people know that, but what they don't take account for is that how many people it added to the United States. And when you add so many more people, you change voting. So with a lot more French and Spanish and other people who were here in this area and the states that would have eventually come of this, the thought was that the South and the West might team up to elect more people like Thomas Jefferson, or elect people who were against the interests of this little area up here called New England. So now voting populations have been changed. So after this is often viewed as a mixed success for Jefferson in his presidency. It's one of the most famous things about his presidency. However, it caused a secession movement that was threatened. It never actually happened, but several people were saying we will have no chance for power in the United States because our power is being diluted by the other people and states that will be added in now. And so one person, Josiah Quincy, said, the bonds of this union are virtually dissolved, meaning basically New England and the states in the region of New England, it's time to leave. It's time to exit and no longer be part of the United States because we're going to lose all our power. The bonds of this union are virtually dissolved, that the states which compose it are free from their moral obligation, and that, as it will be the right of all, so it will be the duty of some to prepare definitely for a separation, amicably if they can, violently if they must. So he says, look, it's time to break up the United States. So it's not one country, it needs to be several countries. That's what his view was. And he says, and we'll do this peacefully if we can, but we're willing to fight for our independence if we have to. Now, this didn't happen, but there are several times throughout Thomas Jefferson's presidency, at his election, at the Louisiana Purchase, and at the Embargo Act of 1807, where it is threatened that states will leave the Union. And they're not states in the South. They're usually states in the North. And they're threatening to exit not because of slavery, but because, number one, they viewed it to be their right. Number two, they view something disagreeable to be happening to them, or their power to be taken away in some measure through whatever's going on politically at the time. So what's interesting about all this history, and that it's history that includes North, South, Middle, and West, is that for a long time, many believed that secession was a right of the American states. And it comes to a head with the Civil War. Now, the question is, does the Civil War settle the issue? Well, in a sense that not many people are asking that question anymore about secession and the reality of secession. It's more in theory. But there are secession movements in the world today, and some things to think about with that. But I do want us to be careful about not thinking that questions like that are just settled because a war was fought and won. Well, yeah, lots of things are fought and won with wars. That doesn't mean that that a question was definitively answered and that it was answered rightly and correctly. So, some things to think about as we continue working through this political history of secession.